listening to a podcast made in collaboration with the Copenhagen College Radio.
Welcome to the second episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, PhD student at the University of Copenhagen. Thanks for joining us. If you like what you hear on the show, tell a friend, tell a colleague, throw us a share on social media. You can find us on Twitter at SMNP Podcast and on Facebook by typing Social Media and Politics in the search box. The topic of today's episode is dual screening. Dual screening is essentially the idea that during big-time political events like debates or elections, many citizens are tuning into traditional broadcast media on one screen, like a television, while at the same time they are keeping up with and taking part in the social media conversation through a second screen, whether that's a computer, tablet, or smartphone. Citizens are therefore switching not just between screens, but also for being information consumers to information producers. And through their social media use, citizens affect the flow of political information online and are engaging with politics in new ways that weren't possible a few years ago. Now, as we're recording this episode, the first U.S. presidential debate between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump just ended, and Twitter reported that it was the most tweeted debate of all time. While we don't have the exact figures yet, we do know that there were more than over 10.3 million tweets sent during the debate, and the topics discussed range from substantial issues like the economy and terrorism to more superficial commentary over Trump sniffles or Clinton's shimmies.
Parody Twitter accounts sprouted pretending to be Trump sniffle.
But what does dual screening actually mean for politics and democracy? Joining us from London via Skype to talk about just that is Dr. Christian Vicari, one of the world's leading researchers on digital media and dual screening. Dr. Vicari is Reader in Politics at Royal Holloway, University of London, and Associate Professor in Political Science at the University of Bologna. His recent article entitled Dual Screening the Political, Media Events, Social Media, and Citizen Engagement, which was co-authored with Andrew Chadwick and Ben O'Loughlin, recently won the American Political Science Association's Best Article of the Year Award in Political Communication. His latest book is Digital Politics in Western Democracies, a Comparative Study, which is published by Johns Hopkins University Press, and you can follow him on Twitter at 25 Lettori. That's the numbers 25 and letters Lettori. Dr. Vicari, pleasure to have you on the show. Thanks for joining us.
Good to be with you, Michael.
So as an expert on dual screening, can you tell us in your own words exactly what dual screening is? And basically, how are citizens using social media to participate in major political events?
Well, we define dual screening as a bundle of practices that involve integrating and switching between and across live broadcast media and social media. Importantly, we don't talk about second screening as if there were a first screen, i.e. television, and a second screen, i.e. a tablet or a phone or a computer where people go on social media. Mm-hmm. And that is because we are agnostic as to whether people get to these important media events through the television or through social media. Actually, in our research, we do find that a sizable amount of the people that took our surveys actually tuned in to the televised debates they ended up watching after reading about them on social media. So people can be pulled into media events through social media, as well as setting out to watch an event and then taking up their phones and starting to read about them or tweeting about them. These practices can range from the relatively passive practice of just reading about an event to the relatively more active practices of commenting about them and engaging in conversations with other people.
Interesting. So it's not that they're actually simultaneously using two screens, but actually that one sort of leads to the other.
Well, it might be. It might be also that they cannot lose track of both. There's commentary on the presidential debates that you mentioned, where a lot of people are saying, mostly, of course, in the media commentariat, but they're saying, I couldn't do this anymore without Twitter or without social media in general, because they have become part and parcel of the context in which these events happen. I think an interesting analogy is with, the fish doesn't know they're swimming in the water. The water is just their environment. And in a way, the way in which political events nowadays take place cannot really be thought about without considering also the role that dual screening plays.
Interesting. So why then does dual screening matter? Like, what impact do you think that it has on politics?
Well, it is still an open question because it hasn't gone on for a terribly long period of time. And we do have some good research coming out from many different academics that have got interested in the topic. But of course, it's still early days, and it's probably going to change as technologies change and as politicians and citizens change the way they use them. But I think, fundamentally, we used to think about media events like presidential debates or the Super Bowl, if you will, as events where elites would carefully choreograph a spectacle that viewers would watch in very large numbers. And we used to think that this would matter because it would have effects on the viewers. And the pre-mediation phase used to matter as well as the post-mediation phase, i.e., in the case of a debate, the classic debate on who won and who lost and what were the key moments.
Right.
Now, with dual screening, audiences are no longer just spectators. Now, I don't take the view that just because people can tweet about the debate, they can influence the debate in the same way as, a journalist or a candidate can influence the debate. But at the same time, we do see people being able to take a more assertive role and exercise their own agency. Perhaps not influencing hundreds of thousands of people, but influencing the people that follow them and the people that listen to them. And this is one of the things we're interested in our research. Do people feel more empowered? Do people feel more influential? And even in theory, even if people do not influence anyone else, but if they feel they do, well, that leads to more, to greater sense of efficacy. And we know that this is important in turn for other forms of participation. So the ways in which dual screening may matter, range from, local individual situations where somebody can affirm a framing of an event that slightly deviates from the dominant framing as is being constructed by the political and journalistic elites, to broader implications in the long term, such as feeling that you have a voice, feeling that you can influence other people, which in turn might affect other types of behavior that have nothing to do with dual screening. Now, as I say that, obviously, there is a lot of research that still needs to be done on these topics, and we're still in the early stages of finding out the answer to your question.
Right. And so kind of dovetailing on that point, let's talk about your research a little bit. As I mentioned in the intro, your paper, Dual Screening the Political, just won a major award from the American Political Science Association. So congrats on that, first of all. And can you tell us a little bit about that project? What did you do? What did you look at? And what did you find?
Of course. Well, first of all, thank you very much, and many, many thanks to our colleagues in the American Political Science Association, in particular the Political Communication Division, for granting us this immense honor. I have no words for how honored we are. So this research really started out as a pilot project, as much research that ends up being interesting does. We set out to really explore issues that we felt were important, but we didn't really know enough about. So in 2014, during the European Parliament election, there was a televised debate between Nigel Farage, the leader of the UK Independence Party, right, the champion of Brexit, and Nick Clegg, who at the time was the Deputy Prime Minister and the leader of the Liberal Democratic Party, which is the in party in the UK, is the party that has most consistently advocated for staying in the European Union and embracing the European Union. Leaders' debate in Britain are not as common as in many other countries. As our listeners may know, the first time in Britain a leaders' debate was organized that looked like a presidential debate in the US was only in 2010. So a debate between these two relatively major party leaders in the course of an election was a pretty big deal in Britain. We wanted to find out about people who would dual screen about the debate. And this is a very specific population, right? It is difficult to understand this population with a general survey or with a general study of a representative sample of the population. This is by no means a representative sample. So how do you talk to these people? Well, you go where they are. And one of the places where they are is on Twitter. And Twitter allows you to identify keywords and to download publicly available tweets based on those keywords. Now, there's a lot of research on dual screening and in general on political communication on Twitter that looks at those data, at what people post, who they follow, who they retweet. And that is very interesting research, but it doesn't tell us what happens outside of Twitter. And it doesn't tell us what happens before and after the event. It only tells us what people are actually saying or how they're behaving on Twitter or on whatever social media you're looking at.
Right.
We thought we wanted to go beyond that So we surveyed a representative sample of people who had posted those messages on Twitter that had to do with the debate. And what this allowed us to do was to have a much more fine-grained image of who they are, what do they do politically, and what they did in terms of their dual screening experience. And then in our research, we tried to look at whether dual screening is associated with levels of political participation outside of dual screening and outside of the internet in many cases. We were able to do that because not only did more than 1,500 people take our first survey, which was taken right after the event, but also another almost 800 people took a second survey right after the election. So we could follow those people's behavior as the campaign progressed.
And you solicited these users from Twitter itself, right? You sent them messages and asked them to participate.
Yes, we sent them messages with a link to an online survey. And the accounts from which we sent those messages had information about the research purposes of our enterprise, and they link to some, more specific information on our methodology. And I really want to take this opportunity to thank the people that took those surveys. It was more than 20 minutes long on average, and we're incredibly appreciative of people's taking the time to fill out that information that has allowed us to learn a lot more about the subject. So when we did the analysis, we found a lot of interesting things. But the bottom line of our research was that even when you look at people's behaviors 2 months after the debate, the more people had been engaged actively in the dual screening experience of the debate, i.e. commenting on the debate as it was happening and engaging with hashtags about the debate, the more people reported being likely to participate in politics even after the election. Mm-hmm. So obviously the people that dual screen, they're not a representative sample. They are more interested in politics. Otherwise, they wouldn't dual screen about the debate. They are better educated, and we report those findings in our paper. But what is interesting is that even among this population, which is generally quite engaged already, specific types of behaviors related to dual screening, in particular those where people would be actively engaging with the conversation rather than just listening or reading, were associated with higher levels of participation even in the longer term, even after the campaign had ended.
Interesting. So what I get from that is you talk about how Twitter users they're not a representative sample of the general population, right? We know from previous research that they're generally more interested in politics and news. They're perhaps more highly educated than the average citizen. So why is it that dual screening research is primarily focused on Twitter? And what about other platforms? Do you think, for example, Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, would engaging in politics or commenting on debates on those sites have similar effects to increase political participation that you found in your study?
Well, I think it is a very good question, and there are basically two sides of it. One is Twitter is not the most important social networking site in the world. It is not the most important one in Britain or in the US. But Twitter is the place that, if you will, heats up the most in terms of social media during these types of events.
Definitely.
People that use multiple social platforms, they might use Facebook for their day-to-day updating about what their friends and acquaintances are doing. But when there is an important media event, they are more likely to use Twitter than the other ones. That, of course, still leaves out a whole lot of people that don't use Twitter. And we know that Twitter, is declining, or at least not growing and not catching up in terms of its user base. But there is a good rationale, the way things being the way I described, for looking at Twitter primarily. However, I wouldn't be honest if I also didn't mention that there is also an availability bias. This is a bit technical, but basically Twitter has an application programming interface, an API, that allows anybody who knows how to do a little bit of coding, or anybody who can afford, to pay some services that enable you to access the data, to access all the public data that is generated therein. And that creates a huge opportunity for researchers to learn about what happens on Twitter, but also for people like us to use that data to then survey people rather than just stop there. Unfortunately, other social media platforms do not have that. Facebook is very obviously careful in terms of what kind of access they allow to the data they have. Even the data you can access, they only include the public pages. So the public page of a politician, you can access and download the conversations that happen there, how many times people have liked the post, or so on and so forth. But because of the way Facebook functions, that doesn't apply to individual profiles. Right. You can only access an individual's profile information if you are friends with that individual. And, that's the way Facebook works, as well as, the kind of business model they have. And the same applies to Snapchat, even more because, Snapchat was originally born to assuage fears that information that you post would stay there forever, and so it gets canceled every 24 hours. It applies to basically, Instagram used to be pretty open, but now they're restricting their platform API as well. So for a researcher wanting to have the same quality of data that they can get on Twitter on other social media platforms, it creates a lot more hurdles to jump. Now, having said that, I am entirely convinced that we need to get there with other social media platforms. If Facebook is where most people are, we need to get into the black box a lot better than we are right now. And I am worried, as somebody who has done research on Twitter, so, I'm partly to blame for scholars reinforcing the implications of this availability bias. I am worried that we're not doing enough. But there is good work that is being done to capture behavior on Facebook, to capture behavior on instant messaging, to capture behavior on Instagram. It just is more difficult technically to do than it is to just, fire up a script and download every tweet with the keywords debates 2016 and get everything that the people have written about on Twitter that is publicly available on the debates.
Right, but as you mentioned, Twitter is the place for live commentary during the debates. But I want to ask you a little bit about the content of that and how it differs or is the same across different national contexts, because there's some research coming out from the University of Wisconsin-Madison that looked at the 2012 debates between Obama and Romney, and they found that the volume of tweets was largely driven by nonverbal cues like the candidates' facial expressions, their physical gestures, and even their blink rates, which essentially suggests that people are tweeting more about the candidates, their physical appearance, for example, than what they actually say. So you've looked at contexts like the UK, Germany, and Italy. But what are people actually tweeting about in the events you've looked at? And does it differ from country to country?
Well, this is a fascinating question. And, as somebody the majority of whose research is comparative, I am very interested in these dynamics. I don't know of any, properly comparative study on dual screening that would allow to answer those questions definitively. All we have is individual country studies where we can, if the methodologies are similar enough, and most of the times they're not, we can compare their findings. For example, there's research on Italy and how people do a screen in Italy by Fabio Giglietto and Silva, who found that the kinds of people that dual screen about different televised programs have political leanings that match those of the programs. So in a country like Italy, where if you're a progressive, you're going to watch a certain show. If you're a conservative, you're going to watch another type of show. Dual screening is politically colored, and the audiences for different types of programs that dual screen are politically skewed in ways that reflect those programs. Whereas in the case of a media system that is more cross-cutting, with most media trying to be at least pretending to be impartial and objective, that might be less the case. And obviously it might be less the case in the case where you have an institutional debate like the ones between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump these days, where you have a bipartisan commission organizing them. So one way in which we can look at the differences is to look at how the differences in media system, and in particular the kind of partisanship of different types of media, might affect the kinds of people that dual screen, and therefore the significance of dual screening in terms of changing people's minds, or mostly firing people up who are already partisan and who are watching a televised program that reaffirms their views. The other thing that might be interesting to look at is along the lines of the Wisconsin study you mentioned. The American political system is candidate-centric. major elections are run between candidates from two major parties, but those candidates don't really mention their parties very much. They try to appeal to independents, and those major parties are big tents ideologically. They're not very well defined in terms of their ideology, although arguably they have become better defined in the last decade or so. Contrast that with a system that is more party-centric, like many European systems, where people mostly vote for parties, not for candidates. It would be interesting to know whether in a televised debate where people are watching candidates who are there mostly as representatives of their own parties rather than as their own man and woman, as in the case of the US or many other presidential systems, whether in those party-centric systems, dual screening about the debate is less about those personal cues and more about perhaps the policies or symbolism that evokes the groups that generally are associated with political parties. But again, these are early days, and usually comparative research takes a little longer to catch up with new phenomena because it takes longer, it's more complicated to study more than a country at the same time. But what I would say is, we can definitely expect that national cultures, national institutions in terms of the media and the political system will shape to some degree the ways in which dual screening pans out in different countries.
Right, and you talk about, or you touched upon this idea of being ideologically colored. So those who might dual screen about a particular topic are watching a program that's already biased in one way or another towards being progressive or conservative, for example. And you've done quite a bit of work on this. You've looked at what you call echo chambers. Can you tell us a bit about what those are and whether dual screening is a way to sort of break echo chambers?
Right. So since the early days of the internet, there's been a long debate about whether the fact that you can select a lot of content on the internet, a lot of the content you consume it because you selected it. Or in terms of social media, the people you are in contact with on social media, you've chosen to be in contact with them, and you can remove them from your timeline or you can silence them, and you have all this control of information that didn't used to be the case in terms of the broadcast media, where you had fewer choices and most people ended up watching the same kinds of programs and accidentally got exposed to information that they would not normally seek. Now, this argument was made early in the early days of the internet and has been reaffirmed in the age of social media by many people. There is concern that algorithms that are supposed to give us what we want on social media also influence these dynamics because Facebook and Twitter and Google, for that matter, know a lot about us. And when they serve us their content, they do that in a way that they think is going to reinforce or they think is going to please us and interest us. And so if Facebook thinks that somebody is a conservative, they might be more likely to give them conservative content that they are more likely to share and therefore, get their numbers up. Now, that's the argument. I believe there is mixed evidence on it. Most of the research that has actually looked at this empirically finds that the amount of people that actually only use social media as an echo chamber, as a place where they get reinforcement, where they only get opinions they agree with, is very limited. Most people will tell you, and in surveys, and there's also evidence based on, unobtrusive analysis of what happens on social media, that they stumble upon content on social media that has to do with politics that they were not necessarily seeking out. Right. And most people will tell you that they do get exposed to opinions they disagree with on social media, as well as opinions they agree with. There's massive evidence that social media are only echo chambers. They can act, obviously, if you police your Twitter feed and your Facebook feed so that, you're a conservative and you don't want to hear anything about anything else than conservatives, and you only want to hear from conservative politicians or people who like conservatives, then by all means you can do that. But most people use social media for reasons other than politics. They use social media to keep up with friends, to keep up with people they trust, to keep up with people they are interested in, to keep up with organizations they are interested in. And a lot of times those decisions are not based on their political leanings or on whether they talk about politics at all. So there are many ways in which social media can actually lead to heightened exposure to political content and to exposure to political content one disagrees with. If I may go back to the screening, the finding I reported at the beginning that a lot of people in our data said that they tuned into the debate after reading about it on social media. Well, some of those people might have not watched the debate were it not for the discussions they found on social media. Also, the finding we had that hashtags are associated with participation, that engaging with the debate via hashtag was associated with higher levels of participation. Well, hashtags, especially during a televised debate where a lot of people are talking, they generally are not partisan oriented. They tend to be, broad frames in which a conversation on the event can happen. And so that shows you that suggests at least that if somebody is engaging with an event via a hashtag, that hashtag might actually be, a broad church, a big tent where many people from different backgrounds might engage. So, obviously there is, for some people, social media and dual screening can be echo chambers. There's no question about that. But the empirical evidence we know of so far suggests that the more pronounced effect, the more widespread effect might actually go in the opposite direction.
And so this leads to the sort of wrapping up now, this idea of accidental exposure or reading about something on social media that incentivizes you or motivates you to go and actually watch the debates and learn about what the candidates are saying. So what are your thoughts on dual screening in democracy? Is the new way of engaging in political events helping or hurting the quality of democracy? And do you expect these practices to increase in the future?
Well, as you know, in our research, we mostly looked at one dimension of democratic quality, which is citizens' participation. And most theorists and scholars of democracy will tell you that for democracy to work well, you need people to participate. We know that we are in an age of disillusion, disaffection, to some degree disengagement, although that needs to be put under a lot of qualifiers. It depends on what you look at. If you look at different ways in which people participate in politics, broadly speaking. And in our findings, we did show that to the extent that dual screening seems to affect political engagement, the effect seems to be positive and not negative. So the argument that the slacktivism argument, if you will, that, all these people, now they believe they can change the world by retweeting stuff that they like, and therefore they will not go out and do things that really matter. That argument, I never thought it was convincing, but the more empirical evidence comes out and the more we see that this is not the case. And by the way, in a lot of ways, there is no hierarchy between retweeting something and spreading it to your friends and talking to someone face to face, knocking on their doors. Right. It's not a given that one is more important than the other. It goes back to, calling it dual screening and not second screening. Obviously, democracy entails many different things, right? So participation is important, but there are other things that are important, like, the quality of people's information, the fact that people, the boundaries of respect for certain civil and political rights are maintained, and that people do not feel they can overly offend people based on racism and sexism. The fact that people have good quality of information from different sources. There are many, and these values sometimes are not easily reconciled, right? The information that fires people up sometimes is information that is very partisan and very incendiary, but it gets people fired up. So we always need to be cognizant and aware that more participation is good to the extent that it's participation that doesn't thwart, if you will, the other principles in which through which democracy functions. I believe, to the extent that people who are feeling increasingly represented by existing institutions that have served democracy very well, like political parties and parliaments and other representative institutions, to the extent that they, and that includes the mass media, by the way, trust in the media is at historic lows in many countries. So to the extent that there is something new that they can exercise their voice and their feeling of being able to express themselves and let their grievances be heard, I believe that is positive. But obviously, we also need to be mindful of the other side of it, which is, incivility, which is the echo chambers we discussed earlier. And, I don't think we should take by definition, rosy view of these phenomena. We need to study them empirically.
All right. The voice you just heard has been that of Dr. Christian Beccari, reader in politics at Royal Holloway, University of London, and associate professor in political science at University of Bologna. You can follow him on Twitter at 25 Lettori. That's the numbers 25 Lettori. Dr. Beccari, thanks so much for joining us, and best of luck in your upcoming research.
Thank you very much, Michael.
That's all the time we have for today. Thanks again for tuning in to the Social Media and Politics Podcast. Keep up with the latest episodes by following us on Twitter at SMNP Podcast, or if you're not an active Twitter dual screener, you can like our page on Facebook. Drop us a line and let us know what you think of the show. Big thanks to everyone here at Copenhagen College Radio. Editing by Peter Urbeck, and the funky jams you're listening to are produced by Earfunk out of New Orleans. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Copenhagen. See you next time.